The first night of the Republican National Convention was largely all about the Democrats. We'll take a look at the U.S. presidential race. Hello there, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Donald Trump promised an uplifting and optimistic vision of the United States for this week's Republican National Convention, but the first night at least had a much different tone. Speakers portrayed their rivals in the Democratic Party, led by candidate Joe Biden, as a menace to the country. From Charlotte, North Carolina, where the convention is being held, Philip Crowther has more.
The tone of this first night of the Republican convention wasn't a particularly optimistic one. It was a mix, rather, between all-out praise for the president from his allies and visions of a presidency under former Vice President Joe Biden, a dark and almost apocalyptic vision of an America where borders are wide open, where voter fraud is rampant, and where violence moves from the cities to the suburbs. The kinds of nightmares, according to one of the speakers, a young Republican, that only the bodyguard of Western civilization, in other words, the president, could save the United States from. Here are some of the other words from some of the closest allies of the president during this first night of the Republican convention.
A Biden-Harris administration would be much, much worse.
Look at what's happening in American cities. Cities all run by Democrats. Crime, violence, and mob rule.
No matter where you live, your family will not be safe in the radical Democrats' America.
You heard there from Nikki Haley, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She was one of those speakers during this first night of the Republican convention who almost reminded us of a Republican Party from before Donald Trump. She did give him his full support, but also seemed to espouse more conservative values that might even survive a post-Trump Republican Party. She wasn't the only one. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina also made a splash yesterday, and both of them brought a little bit of diversity into a party that is currently lacking it, and an electorate for Donald Trump that is lacking it as well. One thing is for sure from this first night is that this Republican Party is turning more and more, though, into the party of Donald Trump. Philip Crowther, CGTN in Charlotte, North Carolina.
We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelist. Amy Holmes joins us from New York. She is a writer for HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher and political columnist for the Swiss Weekly Die Wirtschaft. From Beckley, West Virginia, via Skype, Rina Shah is a political commentator and founder of Republican Women for Biden. Michael Johns is the co-founder and national leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement. He's in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And here in Washington, D.C., Joe Williams is the senior news editor for U.S. News and World Report. I want to thank all of you for coming on the broadcast. Michael, why don't I start with you? As we said, the Trump camp had pretty much promised an optimistic, upbeat convention, but last night I watched the speakers, some saying the Democrats are going to open up the prisons, let everyone out. Another speaker said that there will be discarded heroin needles in the parks. They'll destroy the suburbs. And no matter where you live, your family's not going to be safe. MS-13 gang members are going to be invited to live next door. We imagined a little red meat, but was this a little over the top, do you think?
Well, I think very much on the minds of the American people right now, the fact that streets of Democrat-run cities are in turmoil, and there's been an extraordinary amount of violence, innocent civilians killed. So it's topical. It would almost be negligent not to address it. I think it also would be politically not advantageous to point out the fact that these are happening under Democrat mayors. There's not many examples where the opposite's the case. They presumably have political designs, and the security of the American people in these cities and in all locations is very much an issue. So to the extent that this president is opposing it, seeking to end that level of violence, it becomes advantageous and important, I think, to point that out to the American people, which was done. I do think for the remainder of the week, you're going to see a very upbeat, positive sense of vision for the country, of what another 4 years would mean, and a reminder that the first 3 years before the pandemic in this country were immensely successful. Over 7 million jobs created, wages beginning to rise, substantial restructuring of poor trade agreements abroad and filling of many other promises the president made in 2016.
Rina, you tweeted this. The RNC offered a dark dystopian vision of the country last night. You went on to say, who's buying this beyond the small Trump base? Who is buying it in your estimation?
In my estimation, it remains the same people who love what he had to throw at them from his 2016 playbook. And that's one thing that I know that this party is concerned about, is how do they broaden the base? They haven't been able to do it in these 4 years. It's been shrinking. And so there's a deep concern because there's been some dynamics that have changed as well. Women like myself, under 40, pushing strollers in suburban cities. We are the demographic of conservative women that traditionally would always say, sure, let's vote Republican. You know, sometimes we may swallow it and do it, but we certainly don't vote with our husbands all the time, like people like my mother's age did. And so that's the bigger concern. White, younger than 40, young mothers, suburban mothers, these are the demographic that this Republican Party needs to hold on to. And they know that they've slipped away. They know that they started slipping away in the midterm elections. So this is the harder part for the Trump campaign, and they're going to try everything these 4 days. Everything from presenting Nikki Haley, who in my opinion was once a rising star and is now show how much of a Trump loyalist, by appearing as hypocritical as she did last night, saying that there's no racism in America, but here's my story of overcoming racism. That is exactly what I think the tone will continue to be these next few nights: fear, division, and two Americas.
Joe, let's play an excerpt from last night. This is the speech from the president's son, Donald Trump Jr. Let's listen.
Joe Biden is basically the Loch Ness Monster of the swamp. For the past half century, he's been lurking around in there. He sticks his head up every now and then to run for president. Then he disappears and doesn't do much in between.
Joe, the numbers are out. 4 years ago, opening night, the Republican convention captured 23 million viewers, down about 29% this go-round, just shy of 16 million for opening night, a much larger opening night for the Democrats. And what we saw in Fox, the numbers stayed pretty consistent, but the other networks, the audience actually dwindled as the program went on. Is this a problem for the Republicans?
Unless there's a reversal of fortune or a reversal of rhetoric, I think so. I mean, setting aside Donald Trump Jr.'s mixed metaphor, the Loch Ness Monster is actually in a lake, not a swamp, you did have a very dark vision of America. Now, one of the things that they are trying to portray is the fact that Donald Trump is the sole guardian between you and the hordes that are just waiting to come get you in your suburban homes. But you compare and contrast that with Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill. I mean, this is not a shining city on the hill they portrayed last night. This is a city where they're coming to get you. And that level of paranoia is kind of a turnoff to mainstream voters who, in the margins, will decide this election more or less. I mean, Donald Trump's base is pretty firm. It's stayed steady at between 30 and 40%. Consistently over his presidency. He's not really grown that very much beyond that. Now, if you're looking to recruit suburban women, fear, they say, is the greatest motivator, but it remains to be seen if that's the comparison that we're making here between Reagan's optimistic vision and what he will do for you and what the Republican Party will do for you, and Donald Trump's so far convention last night, where it's all about the president and no we or us or how we're going to move America forward. It's if you don't do this, you're going to die. That's not a message that sells with moderate voters.
And Amy, Joe was saying this is pretty much all about Donald Trump. We're going to see him every night. We saw him last night in some tape pieces where he visited with postal workers, nurses, police officers. Another session where he was there with 6 former American hostages. But Jason Rezaian, a journalist who was held in prison for a year and a half, tweeted today, "Bringing hostages home safely is always a reason for great joy, but using us for political gain is disgusting." So he didn't even get good marks on that. But trying to soften the president in these types of video pieces, is that going to help?
Well, I think that the public pretty well knows who Donald Trump is, and they have watched him for the past 4 years, both running for president and then in his presidency. But I have to disagree that last night was all about doom and gloom and darkness in America. I heard a lot of incredibly uplifting stories. Senator Tim Scott, for example, his line that in one generation in his family, they went from cotton to Congress. Nikki Haley describing her family as seeking and earning the American dream. Maximo Alvarez coming from Cuba. His speech was extraordinarily moving about how lucky and fortunate he felt to come to America, live the American dream, and serve his family, his neighbors, and his community. There was a lot of patriotism on display last night that I think does resonate with moderates and suburban women. But with Donald Trump, again, as I say, he's a pretty well-known quantity. And that was even expressed last night as well. Herschel Walker, the former football player and Heisman Trophy winner, describing Donald Trump, but also saying, you know, hey, people have their opinions of him. I think voters are going to be looking at what is, you know, either Joe Biden or Donald Trump going to do for me, do for this country as we move forward. And what I've learned from last week and this week, that both parties believe that November 3rd is a battle for the soul of America.
Mm-hmm. And Rina, I saw you nodding your head. Did those messages resonate with you?
Well, Amy's spot on with that. There were good messages last night. It wasn't all fear and division because you saw stories of people who were average Americans. And I think in stark contrast to what the DNC presented last week with a bunch of former electeds, people who've been at the highest, places in office in this country. What I heard from the Right to Try woman, the oral surgeon in Louisiana who had COVID himself, he used the phrase, let me give you 3 clear examples of how Donald Trump removed these regulatory obstacles. Using phrases like that, language like that, that definitely was appealing. It was definitely kept me tuned in. Obviously, it's not only my profession to be tuned in, but I felt interested enough. And then there was obviously the family members, the Donald Trump Jr.'s girlfriend, who's getting a lot of play today, Kimberly, for but the reality was, yes, there were true American stories in there, and I think it was just a better production last night. Let me just be honest about that part. It was well produced, it was extremely well done.
And Joe, a new Associated Press poll has the Republican Party approval rating at 35%. 23% see the country moving in the right direction. Those are dire numbers. This election's just around the corner. What do the Republicans need to do in terms of messaging to try and shift those numbers?
I think what they need to do is talk about the coronavirus and how they're going to squash something that's been a pandemic that's like no other. I mean, it's sent people out of work. It's killed almost 200,000 people, more people in the Vietnam War. So I think that that's a message that needs to get out there, that that the president and his administration does have a plan to get the virus under control. I think another message that would help the Republicans would be a more stronger and detailed economic message, which we didn't hear a whole lot about that last night, other than the fact that this is a great economy and things are great, but they really aren't if you look at the numbers. 9% unemployment, hundreds of thousands of people looking for jobs that can't seem to find them, businesses closed down because of the pandemic and because there isn't a real plan to deal with it. We still have a patchwork system of kids going back to school. I think that would be a really good selling point if you have the president saying that he's got a plan for all these things. That would help people perk up their ears and listen. But to Amy's point and to your other guest's point, I mean, you did have some inspirational stories, but they were wrapped around this sort of angry rhetoric. I mean, I don't know if I was listening to the same convention that they were, and I tried to listen to it as an impartial observer, and there was quite a bit of fear-mongering that I heard as a journalist, and it's not usually the thing that sells most to voters who are undecided.
Yeah, Michael, to that point, it didn't seem like it was rather thin on specifics, proposals. The only thing that I heard was in Donald Trump Jr.'s speech talking about getting rid of the payroll tax. But in terms of actual specifics on how to handle the pandemic or racial inequality, some of these other issues, they really didn't hit on that.
Well, it's a very specific 49-point plan that the Republican National Committee and the administration released that goes into great detail about job creation, wage growth, national security, foreign policy issues, the pandemic, the vaccine, which is expected to be commercially available in the United States for the end of the year, and the president's plans across the board. So I think you had a good number of details that come out. I think these are always challenging conventions. I personally didn't think the Democrat convention got into much of any detail as it relates to the magnitude of impact that its big government and big tax plans would have on this country. And, in some respects, it's part look and feel and part, the substance of the agenda, and keeping a sort of happy balance between those two. I think you'll have plenty of an idea of what the president will be looking to do in the next 4 years by the end of the week, and that'll include significant job creation, getting beyond the pandemic, continuing to build American strength in the world, restructuring the trade agreements in favorable ways, and bringing wealth, prosperity, and safety to our cities, which is very much in need right now.
Rina, you created this group called Republican Women for Biden. The poll that I was referring to earlier shows that just 79% of Republicans approve of Trump. 20 former Republican office holders have signaled their support for Biden. Of course, he made a pitch for Republicans last week, gave a prominent role to John Kasich, the former governor of Ohio, also a former congressman from Ohio, Republican, and of course, Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State in the Bush administration. Talk to me about how the dynamic has changed 4 years later after 2016 and today.
And well, let's not forget the women that were showcased last week as well. Former elected Congresswoman Susan Molinari, Governor Christine Todd Whitman, Meg Whitman, a successful CEO. These were women that have been Republicans that spoke freely at the DNC because they're worried about the erosion of trust in our institutions, about how Donald Trump has not respected our co-equal branches. He undermines the rule of law. He uses law and order and in such a way that we've never seen in modern times from the Oval Office. So what we see right now, I believe in women that are Republicans, is a genuine fear that another 4 years of Donald Trump could lead to more division. We don't want a divided country, especially at a time where we're facing down this pandemic and a potential second wave. The first wave had more spikes than one could have even expected. And listen, there's been no plan by this administration to handle this pandemic. They first of all misstepped largely because they called it a Democratic hoax when it hit our shores. That did not allow for our federal government to have the proper response. And so as a limited government proponent, somebody that's been with this Republican Party since I was age 18, I'm shocked that this federal administration, this Trump administration, was not able to do its role, was not able to bring forward a unified federal response to help us in a time of great crisis. And now with the United States Postal Service and his hand in mail-in voting and how this president has spoken to essentially committing an illegal act, voter suppression, I think we are past the point of return, and this president should be denied another 4 years because he can't be trusted. He wants to be a dictator and a king.
Amy, there's an article in the New York Times from former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele criticizing Trump and this strategy, saying he's doubling down on his base instead of broadening his appeal, trying to get the Rinas who've kind of drifted away. Do you agree with Michael Steele's assessment?
Well, Michael Steele is a friend and a longtime critic of Donald Trump, so I'm not surprised that he's being critical of the strategy. My understanding from one of Trump's pollsters, John McLaughlin, is that their strategy is a get out the base strategy. And on election day, they are targeted to their loyal voters. Now, remember that Donald Trump in 2016, he won by the electoral map and only by 80,000 votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, in these very targeted places. And the Trump campaign was very savvy in that strategy. I think they're hoping for a replay of that Biden may well win the popular vote, just as Hillary Clinton did, with votes in California and New York basically making up the difference, but that the Trump team is going to play the electoral map. I don't know if that's going to work for them again, but my understanding is that's the play.
Joe, that's such a narrow path. Can he do it 2 times?
It's hard to say, never say never and never say that something won't happen in politics, because there are very many smart people, myself included, who didn't see a way that Donald Trump could get to the White House. So no, anything is possible. It is a narrow path, however, because you've got states in play that weren't in play in 2016, rather Texas, for instance, Arizona, you name it, he's behind in practically all of the battleground states, and in some battleground states by double digits. I think the difference between now and 2016 is that the public and the voters have gotten a belly full of Donald Trump, and so far, you know, it's hard to see where people outside of his base like what he's doing.
Michael, one of the speakers last night, Rina already referred to this, is former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. Let's listen to what she had to say.
In much of the Democratic Party, it's now fashionable to say that America is racist. That is a lie. America is not a racist country.
As she was saying that, there were protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin after another shooting. A 26-year-old man was shot in his SUV, had a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, and 8-year-old sons in it. Racial injustice has been a big, key part of this campaign since May after the George Floyd death. Is that message going to resonate, do you think, with voters?
I think it's obviously an issue. I mean, you have really Joe Biden with no track record of ever addressing this. His crime bills in the mid-90s were basically designed to lock people up for long periods of time. President Trump came forward with the First Step Act, which was the first real major piece of criminal justice reform in modern times. That's encouraging. I also think it's proving increasingly a big mistake to describe African Americans as some monolithic vote. You have in recent polling 25% of African Americans identifying as conservatives, 43% identifying as moderates, and a president who, before the pandemic, had African American unemployment at the lowest level in American history, had done a great deal to provide funding for historically black colleges, the criminal justice reform, like I mentioned, and a economic climate generally that was starting to see jobs and wages created in areas of this country where it hadn't been historically. So and last night I thought was emphasized again with, you had the Herschel Walker presentation, kind of reiterating this multi-decade relationship that he's had with the president, and a former Democrat from Georgia who spoke about why he's left the Democrat Party and African American and embraced President Trump. And then, of course, Tim Scott, the Tea Party supported first African American Republican U.S. Senator in history, who laid out, I thought, a great case for the president's reelection. So I think, Trump did better than Romney, did better than McCain with African American votes. And I think he's well positioned to do better with African Americans in 20 than he did in 16.
Well, he made that pitch last night, Amy. Is that gonna play well?
I think it has yet to be seen. And remember, Donald Trump only needs to make a few percentage points gains with African American voters to deny Joe Biden the White House. And when I was watching last night, I thought, what a difference it makes when you have two parties that are actively vying for the African American vote. Last week, the Democrats were laser focused on the African American vote because there is concern that Joe Biden is not energizing African American voters. You remember Charlemagne the God when Joe Biden blurted out, "If you don't vote for me, you're not black," that disastrous interview. Well, Charlemagne the God told him that he wasn't actually worried about voter suppression. He was worried about voter depression. And enthusiasm has been a big problem for the Joe Biden campaign. On the Republican side, what I saw last night was a Republican Party that was making an active and strenuous effort to appeal to African American voters, particularly young African American males. Again, all they need to do is get a few percentage points, and the Democratic Party's in a lot of trouble.
Rina, the Democrats only need to pick off a few Republicans here and there, and already you're in line to vote for Biden. With a pandemic, an economy that's been really hit hard by this virus, racial inequality is an issue as well. Do you find it surprising that this party doesn't even have a platform this year?
I'm not surprised by that. I was a delegate elected to the 2016 RNC convention, and I was shocked by how watered down this platform was, whittled down to so few pages from what it had traditionally been. I was on my local party's platform committee and spent many hours discussing with my fellow platform committee members what would be more reflective of the GOP we wanted in the future. We've come so far away from that. The GOP does not even look anything at all like this United States. It does not reflect the diversity of this country, and they can say it all they want because that's what they've been winning on, it seems, or quote unquote winning on in these past few years. They think if they say it, it must be true because a lot of their most ardent, staunch supporters are the ones that say, well, if the president says it, it must be true. And that is the gaslighting that I've been worried about for a while. And look, let's go just beyond what the efforts are to get more minorities voting Republican. The reality is this president has not loudly denounced white supremacy. He said there were fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, riots, peaceful protesters. These are people, these are events rather that the president has not addressed like a leader. And so I think that there is a silent a group of folks out there in every pocket, every state of this great United States that are going to say, is my life better off this year than it was 4 years ago? And they're going to reject Trump for that reason. And they're going to say the better, safer choice is Joe Biden, who will indeed surround himself with the best people and not treat the White House like a revolving door.
Joe, the Washington Post had this headline recently. Trump looks to the convention for a campaign reboot. Obviously, he's down, as you pointed out, in some of these polling in Texas and some of these other major states. What does he need to say in his speech later this week?
There's going to be a distinct difference between what he needs to say and what he actually will say. What he would need to say would be reaching out, talking about building a coalition across the political spectrum. What we're likely to hear is more of what we've heard so far about how Democrats bad, Trump good. But I do want to pick up on a couple of points. I mean, if the Republican Party is making an appeal for black minority voters, for young black men, it was hard to see where that appeal was coming from. I mean, Herschel Walker was a name maybe 30 years ago that probably 10% of young black men under age 25 would be able to identify. Second, Tim Scott really didn't have anything relevant to say in his appeal for black voters other than his personal story. And certainly, as the pandemic rages on, as more African Americans die from the pandemic than white Americans do, and as there's no concrete plan to get that under control, and as the president himself is underwater with, he's not even underwater, he's at the bottom of the ocean with black voters when it comes to polling. I think he's probably south of 5%. And a recent poll indicated that some 80 to 90% of African Americans view this president as racist. So if there was an appeal, I don't think it was there. I think the people of color who were speaking of the Republican Party on the platform were there just to make whites more comfortable.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter, Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.